Once again, happy Australia Day. I'm very, very happy to be here, and also thank you very much for everybody turning out today and coming here. Now, the reason that I've travelled down here is that we have formed an organisation called Australians for Better Government, and there was in fact a opinion stated here that we don't need a new constitution, and that opinion could quite possibly be correct. The constitution is a living document, and the constitution can be modified in accordance with the wishes of the people. And we intend to try and put forward cogent arguments as to why certain things have to be changed. Now, in talking about Australians for Better Government, there are three aspects that we need to bring to you. The first is, why are we doing it? The second thing is, what would it consist of? And the third thing is, how would we see us achieving this? So let's talk about the why. There was a little joke made about the Australia's national flag being at half-mast because of the nature of the government which we all labour under, pun intended, at this moment. And that, if you think that's the situation, you may be a little misguided, because the deterioration of Australia actually started in 1855 with the passing of the New South Wales Constitution Act in the British Parliament. That was a constitution which was formed by two autocratic governors, Gipps and Fitzroy, advised by two autocratic wealthy elites, William Wentworth and John MacArthur. We then went forward to 1901. We held numerous constitutional conventions in the 1890s, and we were under the apprehension that the King owned all of Australia and we were subjects of the King. Now, the Americans in 1786 split from that and said, we are subject to nobody other than the Creator. And that changed completely the complexion of their government and where they went forward. Unfortunately, we started from the belief that we're all slaves to a monarch, that the monarch is superior to us. Instead of this being government by the people, for the people, it was a government which would serve the hierarchy. We have been a victim of this ever since. Even things like, you may take for granted, the minimum wage is a gross intrusion on your liberty, because an employer enters into a consensual arrangement with an employee. The government has no right to tell the employer what they should pay that employee, provided that the employee has the option to go and get a job somewhere else or create their own business. And if government has a role, it is in creating that environment where it makes it easy for someone to leave their present employment if they are unhappy and to find new employment somewhere else or to start their own business. And I raise that because it is an excellent example of how you can solve a problem. It is unfair that people do not get paid what they are worth. No doubt of that. It is unfair. Now, you can either solve that problem by authoritarianism, or you can solve it by being innovative. And it is by being innovative that you bring society forward. The reason free enterprise is such a powerful thing is it taps the imagination, the innovation, and incentivizes everybody to work out better ways of doing things. The problem with collectivism or socialism is that people fall into a hierarchy, and the way that they end up at the top is how well they can play the political game, whether it be a corporate political game or whether it's a game in society. Me personally, I became worried about things when anthropogenic global warming came onto the scene. And the reason for this is that I studied thermodynamics to fourth year university level, and I graduated with honours. And I can tell you now, as somebody who is, or was, my knowledge is greatly atrophied, but I was expert in these matters, and there is no way within the laws of physics that carbon dioxide can appreciably warm the Earth's atmosphere. And I've read a number of papers which suggests it is exactly the opposite. And in fact, interestingly, all of the proxy data going back 8,000 years indicates that when you have an increase in carbon dioxide, temperatures actually fall. And I've read scientific papers which put forward cogent arguments as to why that should be the case. So I'm concerned about this, and I'm starting to see that the real agenda here is wealth transfer. What you do is you start paying people subsidies because energy is so expensive, and you take it off those people who have money and can afford, in inverted commas, to have the money taken off them so that you can take their wealth and give it to other people. It's a wealth distribution ploy. But another group has come, and they're people who are wealthy elites, such as Simon Holmes à Court, who funded the Teals to $20 million, but since then he has made easily $100 million by selling to Australia unreliable renewables. So it was a good business investment from his point of view, but it's been disastrous for our country because energy is at the bottom of everything. Everything you touch, everything you do, everywhere you go depends on energy. And if it is expensive, then you are being impoverished. And that money, as John Ruddick quite rightly pointed out, is going somewhere. It is going to the wealthy elite. It is going to those persons who, through collectivism, have risen to the top of a political pyramid. So I'm becoming concerned about that. And then COVID comes on the scene. And initially I was very worried about COVID. Why would I be that? Because about 35 years ago, I was seconded to the British Army for 4 years, and I was trained in biological warfare by some of the best people from Porton Down, the germ warfare establishment in the United Kingdom. And the focus of our studies was on how the coronavirus spreads. And they were looking at what exactly caused the coronavirus to preferentially be able to latch on to human cells. And they were looking at whether it was possible to modify that surface coating so that it would be genetically specific. E.g., if I wanted to wipe out the Han Chinese, could I change the structure of that coating so that it would preferentially latch on to angiotensin converting enzyme class 2 cell coatings on a Han Chinese and leave Caucasians alone? Well, interestingly, COVID-19 attacked black people, people of African descent, more than those people who had O-positive blood groups. And that's the upper Caucasians have O-positive blood groups. So I'm starting to get a bit worried about what's happening. And the very first thing I had been taught in biological warfare was you ascertain what the threat is. And what you do is you look at what's called the infection fatality rate and the case fatality rate. I won't take you through that because I've got very little time to talk to you. And I want to talk to you about Australians for Better Government, and I'm explaining to you right now the why. Why are we doing this? Well, the first thing is I could not get from government any sort of statistics which would allow me to determine the case and infection fatality rates. This was anonymous. I mean, why would that be? And then I asked the doctor, would he please find out the vitamin D levels of those persons who were succumbing to this disease, if indeed they were succumbing to this disease at all. He came back to me and said, it's too difficult. No one will talk to me. No one will help me. Then the next thing that happened was they banned early treatment. By doing that, they killed unnecessarily thousands of elderly Australians. So now my psyche is going into, holy shit, they're murdering us. This is murder.
It's genocide.
There's no question of it. This is murder. Okay, well, actually, it's not genocide because they goofed. They didn't come up with a coating that would whack out a particular genome. That's what genocide is. What you're talking about is basically democide. In other words, you're trying to annihilate a demography. Okay, the whole people. You want to reduce the population of the world by whatever method. So at that stage, I became very politically active. I was a member of the National Party. I actually spoke at the federal conference in Canberra, and I advocated in my speech that we should terminate the contract of the French submarine contract and that we should lease submarines from the American Navy. We should become part of the American Pacific Fleet. And 3 weeks later, that's exactly what happened. Barnaby Joyce came up and congratulated me on my speech, and then the buggers completely sabotaged it by entering into AUKUS, which was exactly what I had said not to do. We will not get those subs until after 2050, and China has a stated objective of being the supreme power of the world by 2049, and it is well on its track to doing that. And part of this is climate change. They have deliberately organised that Maurice Strong, who had to eventually go to China in order to seek to solve or get away from prosecution, they set him up in the IPCC. They set Tedros up in the WHO, and guess what happened? Western economies are completely impoverishing themselves with this myth called climate change, and we're now made at least 70% of our population incurably sick by injecting them with an mRNA vaccine, which was non-specific. It has gone to every part of people's bodies. The good news is, by the way, my good friend Professor Peter McCulloch tells me that about 70% of the injections were faulty because they weren't kept at the right temperature. So they haven't had the desired effect. But at least 2%, and that's a huge number of people, at least 2% of our population has been very seriously damaged. In my case, in my personal case, my son-in-law's parents both got boosted, and a few weeks later they died of massive heart attacks. Penny Bailey had no history of heart disease whatsoever. My daughter-in-law was forced by the education department to be injected after the first, and she had a medical exemption, which they would not acknowledge. Dr. Mark Hobart, who is a friend of mine, gave my daughter-in-law that exemption, and rightly so. But she had one injection, she went blind in the left eye and had excruciating migraines for 3 months. She has recovered, thank God. My grandson at Brisbane Grammar School, Church of England Boys Grammar School, he was in his senior year, they were forced to get the injection. He spent a week in bed with pericarditis. This is very serious, and it has touched me. And that's the why I have decided that there must be something intrinsically wrong with our system of government. Now, the how or the what. What is wrong? Our system of election is such that people who are uninterested in politics actually determine who gets elected. How does this happen? We have compulsory voting. And by the way, I am a believer in compulsory voting. I believe that everybody has a civic duty to get involved in politics, to learn who's running for office, and then to make a considered vote. I don't care whether they don't vote for me or they don't vote for John. Well, actually, I do care if they don't vote for John. But I don't care, so long as they're making a considered and informed vote. And that is not what is happening at present. So how can we change this? The very first thing we can do is we can put the names on the ballot in random order such that every ballot you hand out is different to the last. That gets rid of the donkey voter, because the donkey voter is going to put one next to a different person each time. The next thing you do is you do not allow the handing out of how to vote cards at the polling stations. If someone can be convinced how to vote a few minutes before they cast their vote, they've given no thought to what is an extremely important action, our country's future. So you do not allow them. What is happening at present is whatever party can muster the maximum amount of people to be down there at the polling booths with all their banners and their corflutes all jostling for position, they're the ones that stand the greatest chance of getting elected. And I also, by the way, I have run now for public office 3 times, and every time I've had to go to Mullumbimby and I've had to participate in the drawing of names out of either a cage or a hat. And that determines where you sit on the ballot. Now, that is a tacit admission by the authorities that whoever gets to the top of that ballot stands a much better chance of being elected than someone who's in the middle or possibly even at the bottom. That should not be the determinant as to who gets into Parliament. It is fundamentally flawed. Okay, now the next thing is on the ballot, there should not be a political party mentioned. If you don't know what party people are in, you shouldn't be voting. Okay, so we get rid of that. Next, let's move to the councils. If you want to put up election signage, you have to go and ask people to put the signage in their property. And a lot of people say, look, I've got neighbours, they may not agree with your particular type of politics. I want to stay friends. I can't let you put the thing in there. So why isn't the council allocating public land along major thoroughfares where it would not cause an accident or obstruction and draw names from a hat to decide who's going to get these allotments? Wouldn't that make sense? That levels the playing field. Okay, the next one is election donations and so forth. I have to go through hell, because I'm an independent, to account for all the people who give me money and then how I've spent it. Wouldn't it be better, if they're going to impose this system, that the Electoral Commission runs the account, my donors put the money into that account, and those people can carry the administrative and accounting load to do all the accounting? Because I've got a life to lead. I could be earning a living. Instead, I'm sitting for a week, a solid week, doing my accounting. The reason I mention that is that I want a parliament that's full of independents. I want a parliament that's full of minor parties. I want a parliament where proper debate takes. That's where the word parliament comes from, parley, to talk. I want all the bills to be exhaustively debated, because every time they pass a bill, they're encroaching in some way upon your liberty. It's a very serious matter, and therefore it shouldn't be rushed into. Let's talk about the bicameral system of parliament. We have a Senate and we have a lower house. Nobody should be allowed to run for the Senate that belongs to a political party. Yes, everybody can belong to a political party, but the moment you decide you're going to run for the Senate, you must, like a person who's running for the federal government, must disavow themselves of any other nationality that they may have held. You must disavow yourself of any affiliation you may have with a political party or a political organisation. Now, sure, if you're a Labor man or a woman, you'll always be a Labor man or a woman, and people will know your genealogy. But when you get into that Senate, by making you disavow yourself, we, the people, are sending a very strong message to you that you will not allow party politics to impact upon your decision. You are there to check legislation, and you should not care where it came from. You should look at the merits of that legislation. And it makes it much easier for you if you don't no longer belong to the Labor Party or the Greens to say, look, this is something up with which I will not put. This is wrong. Because then you're not going to suffer the acrimony and the shame of being chucked out of your party that you've been a part of for the last 50 years. So nobody running for the upper houses anywhere should belong to a political party or a political organisation. And sure, they can beforehand, but when they run, everybody runs as an independent, which brings me to the next point, which is above and below the line voting. 92% of Australians vote above the line. I wonder why that is. Because if you vote below the line, and I run as an independent, people have to number 1 through to 15. Now, even with that impost, I got 8% of the vote. We should not have above and below the line voting. Since they introduced that in 1984, there hasn't been a true independent elected to the Senate. And this is the very place where we need independent thought. This is where we need argument. This is where we need disagreement and debate. And that's why I say I don't mind people saying, oh, I don't think the Constitution should be altered. I'm happy with that.
Altered, not a whole new Constitution.
Right. But then this is a question of degrees. When does a Constitution become whole new and when it doesn't? Remember, 1855, New South Wales Constitution Act. All of the constitutions of all of the states are based upon that constitution. None of those constitutions protect the rights of individuals. And in fact, all we've got is a gaggle and an accumulation of laws which have been passed by the foxes who have been entrusted to look after the chickens. We need to start at the states and the territories. we need to start with constitutions that safeguard our interests, limit the power of the politicians, and also specify the structure of the government that will exist. Now, Queensland in 1917 held a referendum to ask whether they could dissolve the upper house. And the people of Queensland said no. 60% of the people of Queensland said no. But Ted Theodore, the Premier, otherwise known as Red Ted, wasn't happy about this because he couldn't be the authoritarian that he dreamed he wanted to be. So he organised that Hamilton Gould Allen, who was then the governor, would select, as they could in those days, people to be in the upper house. And he selected some large number. It was some number greater than 20 people to go into the upper house who were all Labor chumps. And they still couldn't get it. When they voted to dissolve the upper house, which, by the way, this is another part of the tragedy of our system, that a house could even be allowed to dissolve itself. It should be the people that decide whether that house exists or not. And the people had decided they wanted it. But anyway, he couldn't get it through. So Gould Allen said, oh, I can't be associated with this. I'm suddenly sick. And he was just sick and ashamed of what had happened. So he retired, and Lennon, who was the president of the lower house, was selected by Red Ted to be the lieutenant governor who would take over from Gould Allen. And of course, Lennon then, hot diggity, another 3 people into the upper house. We've done it. We've gotten rid of the upper house of Queensland. Now we can come up with anything we like. And that's exactly what they do. Whenever you've got some contentious bit of legislation, go and get it passed in the Queensland Parliament and then use that as the basis for getting it into all of the other states as well. Who said our system of government isn't broken? Right? We have some really, really serious problems. And the biggest problem of all, the reason that John Locke and Baron von Montesquieu came upon the idea of the separation of powers, that is to say that there should be a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive, and they should be separate. We don't. We don't have that at all. Our governors and governor-generals are ciphers of the premiers and the Prime Minister, respectively. What is a cipher? They're a parrot. They're a puppet. They do exactly as they're told. And that's what our governors-general and governors do. Now, I could take you to fluoridisation as well of water. And there is an argument. People passionately say, oh yes, it reduces caries, and other people say, no, it doesn't. And I've read the book. I've read lots of books on it, and I have my own opinion. But the opinion I hold most firmly is that it is unethical, totally unethical, to force upon anybody a medication without their informed consent. And it is even worse. When we do force this medication on them, we force it in an unprescribed quantity. If people do a lot of sport and they drink a lot of water, they're ingesting one hell of a lot of fluoride. And that includes babies. And we've now found that the intellectual development of children, it would appear, is affected by the amount of fluoride that they're taking. So we're in this situation where we have mediocre people in our parliament. People go into parliament for many, many reasons. And most of them, the significant number of them go in there for bad reasons. And I'm not kidding. They are not there to try and do good, and I don't even subscribe to the idea that because I have been deeply into a political party. There are people who believe they were born to lead, there are people who believe they know everything, and they are people who believe that you are their subjects, and they want to be in the parliament. That's the worry. Now, because we don't have a proper separation between our 3 branches of government, the Prime Minister and his cabinet can have a sudden rush of blood to the head in the cabinet, rush back into the legislature and pass the law, because they belong to the majority government. That's not a separation of power. A separation of power is where the legislature creates a law and tells the executive to get on with it. And the executive has the power to say, no, this is a very bad law, I'm not going to do this. And if they reach a deadlock, the matter has to be resolved by the people, not by the parliament, not by deals done under the table. It has to be taken to the people. We take very ordinary people who we elect to represent our interests and concerns, and we put them into a parliament, be it at state level, territory level, or at the federal level. And then from this very ordinary, mediocre group of people that you would never employ to run your business, we select some that have portfolios, and they go across and they run billion-dollar enterprises. Is that the way you should run a country? It's ludicrous, it's nuts. But you try and tell the politicians that, because I've just described the complexion of their personalities before. They believe they're superior. They believe they know everything. They believe, oh yeah, I can run a government department. And there are others who say, oh no, they're only there to oversee the department. Well, if that's the case, how come they're expected to resign from politics if something dreadfully goes wrong in that department? That's a big pressure for a minister to get intimately involved in what the hell is going on in the department. Now, a better proposal would that we elect the Governor-General and we elect the governors. And when we elect them, the criteria that we decide is not whether they're good politicians, but whether they're good businessmen or women, whether they've actually created businesses, whether they've actually employed people, whether they've taken risks, whether they're innovative. And the next thing is that if you put someone in that position, you have to allow them to pick the head and the deputy head of every department. Once upon a lifetime ago, I was the head of maintenance support for the Civil Aviation Authority of Australia. And it was a very lonely position for me to be in, because my deputy head was constantly trying to white-ant me. He was a professional public servant. And if I did anything, that person would sneak a little memo out to everybody to let them know what I was up to, in order to sabotage any of my initiatives. I have dealt with public servants. I spent 32 years in the army and I rose to a very senior rank. And I've had to deal with public servants. And public servants will not take a risk. And the reason they won't take a risk is if you do nothing, you will do nothing wrong. And instead, what they do is they're involved in playing politics, going to the right cocktail parties, kissing the right ass, and they get elevated to secretary and deputy secretary. And these people are numpties, almost to a man. Sometimes one squeezes through. Sir Arthur Tang may have been one of them. But in general, they are all numpties. And many of them, by the way, have been selected along the lines of DEI. You know, whether they're female or whether they're male, got to have a proper balance, yada, yada. Forget about merit. And that's why you need to have the Governor and the Governor-General select from anywhere in the world. And I say that, and people may disagree with that. You know, patriots will say, oh, no, got to be an Australian. I said, no, they're running a business. And if the Governor-General's got to take the rap for things that go wrong, the Governor-General should be able to pick anybody the Governor-General chooses to run those departments, subject to the agreement of the Senate, which, by the way, is now populated with independents, I hasten to remind you. So you're not going to have the Democrat-Republican bullshit that they have in the United States. The decision as to whether the Governor-General's choice will go ahead or not is dependent upon a whole bunch of independent thinkers. Now, if there should be a deadlock where the Governor-General says, no, I've got to have this person, you people are being driven by, climate change, idiocy, ideology, then the matter is taken to the people. And there's a double dissolution of the Parliament and the Governor-General, and the people get to decide who's going to do what to whom. Now that's the what am I trying to do? And now, by the way, I wouldn't be here today were it not for Stephen Tripp. I can't laud his praises high enough. And I know I'm embarrassing him, but I have to say this, and I always say this. He deserves the credit for everything that is happening, because without him, I would be useless. Okay, so now the how. How are we going to do this? Well, the way we're going to do it is we're going to recruit everybody in Australia that we can motivate, incentivise, and believe in the merits of what I've just described to you, that our government has sent us on a course of destruction since 1900 to the present day. It wasn't deliberate. It was a result of our heritage, that we started believing that we were subject to a hereditary monarch. We had a whole lot of baggage. But now, 125 years after Federation 1, I would invite you to participate in Federation 2. And thank you very much for listening to me.